Have you ever wondered whether the man hailed as the father of psychoanalysis was truly a revolutionary genius who unlocked the hidden corridors of the human mind, or a master of persuasive storytelling whose theories were built more on master of persuasive storytelling speculation than science? Was Sigmund Freud a prophet who revealed the unconscious to the modern world, or a charlatan who cloaked cultural prejudices in scientific jargon? This is the paradox that surrounds Sigmund Freud. His name is etched into the history of psychology, medicine, and even literature. Yet almost every major idea he proposed has been challenged, revised, or outright rejected by later generations of scientists. And still, Freud endures, quoted, debated, adapted into art and film, referenced in casual conversation when someone slips and says, "Oops, that was a Freudian slip." He remains larger than life, a figure both revered and reviled, both indispensable and suspect. To understand Freud's life and career, we cannot begin with his childhood in the provincial town of Freiburg, nor with his studies in Vienna. No, the only way to capture the power of Freud's story is to plunge directly into the firestorm of controversies that still swirl around his name. From accusations of scientific fraud to claims of misogyny, from cocaine experiments to theories of infant sexuality, Freud's career was a theater of disputes as much as it was a saga of discovery. Before we follow Freud's personal journey, let us set the stage with the controversies that have ensured his permanent place in both fame and infamy. Critics like philosopher Karl Popper have long argued that Freud's psychoanalysis fails the basic test of science. A genuine scientific theory must be falsifiable. It must be possible to prove it wrong with evidence. Freud's theories, however, seem to fit every possible outcome. If a patient resisted therapy, Freud called it resistance. If they embraced therapy, that was progress. Every dream, every slip of the tongue, every symptom could be folded neatly into Freud's framework. Was this brilliance, or was it circular logic masquerading as science? Few ideas shocked the public more than Freud's insistence that sexuality lies at the heart of human development. His stages of psychosexual growth, oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital-painted childhood, not as an innocent period, but as a battleground of erotic energies. And then came the Oedipus complex, suggesting that boys unconsciously desire their mothers and see their fathers as rivals, while girls suffer from penis envy. To modern ears, these claims sound outrageous, even offensive. Were they daring truths about human nature, or projections of Freud's own cultural and personal anxieties? Freud's reputation rested heavily on his clinical cases: Anna O., Dora, the Rat Man, the Wolf Man. These stories became legends in the history of psychology. But later, historians discovered troubling patterns. Freud sometimes altered or omitted details to make the cases better fit his theories. Dora, for instance, abandoned treatment after just 11 weeks, but Freud still published her case as though it validated his methods. Such manipulation raises difficult questions. Was Freud honestly describing reality, or was he editing reality to suit his hypotheses? Freud's views on women are some of the most bitterly contested aspects of his work. He described femininity as inherently lacking, defined by the absence of a penis. He argued that women were more narcissistic, more prone to hysteria, and less capable of achieving full independence than men. To feminist thinkers, these views were not just outdated, they were harmful, reinforcing patriarchal stereotypes under the guise of medical science. Did Freud's theories liberate humanity from repression, or did they imprison women in new chains of scientific inferiority? Early in his career, Freud became fascinated with a new substance, cocaine. He believed it could treat depression, digestive issues, even morphine addiction. He praised it in academic papers and even prescribed it to friends. But cocaine's dangers soon became clear: dependence, psychosis, collapse. Freud's enthusiasm faded, but his reckless promotion left a stain on his reputation. Here was a man hailed as a healer, yet one who had nearly unleashed another epidemic of addiction. Freud's intellectual empire was built not only on ideas but on conflicts. He gathered disciples Carl Jung, Alfred Adler, Wilhelm Steckel, only to see them drift away or be expelled when they challenged his authority. Jung wanted to expand psychoanalysis beyond sex. Adler emphasized feelings of inferiority. Steckel pursued symbolic interpretations Freud disliked. One by one, they fell out of favor. Freud, it seemed, demanded loyalty as much as truth. Was this the behavior of a visionary protecting his legacy, or of a dogmatist unwilling to tolerate dissent? Because Freud himself thrived on controversy. He was not a timid scientist who quietly published results. He was a cultural figure, a provocateur, a man who dared to say what others would not. He lived in a Vienna bursting with intellectual ferment, yet he was always on the edge of scandal, both admired and despised. To understand Freud's life and career, we must hold these contradictions in our hands. He was at once scientist and storyteller, healer and manipulator, liberator and oppressor. Only then can we trace his biography, his Jewish upbringing in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, his struggles as a physician, his discovery of the unconscious, his creation of psychoanalysis, and his eventual exile during the Nazi rise to power. Was Sigmund Freud truly a genius who unlocked the hidden corridors of the human mind? Or was he a skilled storyteller whose theories were built on fragile foundations of speculation? Was he the prophet of the unconscious who revealed the truths of desire and repression, or a charlatan who dressed cultural prejudices in the language of science? These questions have haunted Freud's reputation for over a century, and they refuse to fade away. Even now, long after his death, the figure of Freud looms large, invoked by scientists, mocked by skeptics, referenced in novels and films, and casually quoted whenever someone laughs about a so-called Freudian slip. He is a man at once indispensable and suspicious, revered and reviled, a titan whose shadow still stretches across psychology and beyond. To step into Freud's story, one cannot begin gently with the provincial calm of his childhood in Freiburg, or the dusty lecture halls of Vienna. The only honest way to approach him is to plunge straight into the storm of controversies that swirled around his name during his lifetime and continue to swirl today. He built a system of thought that he called psychoanalysis, a method of exploring the unconscious, a new map of the psyche that divided the human mind into hidden chambers of instinct, repression, and desire. But almost every part of this system has been challenged. Was it science, or was it elaborate myth-making? Critics like the philosopher Karl Popper have dismissed Freud's theories as unfalsifiable. A true scientific idea, Popper argued, must risk being proven wrong. Freud's ideas seemed to work in reverse. They explained everything, no matter what happened. If a patient resisted analysis, Freud called it resistance, proof of the theory. If they embraced it, he called it progress, also proof of the theory. Dreams, slips of the tongue, hysterical symptoms, all could be folded neatly into his framework. The brilliance lay not in the evidence, but in the ingenuity of the explanation. To some, this was a revolution in human self-understanding. To others, it was a clever trick, an intellectual trap that swallowed all possible objections. What disturbed people even more was Freud's relentless focus on sexuality. He claimed that childhood, far from being an innocent period, was saturated with erotic drives. He proposed stages of psychosexual development: oral, anal, phallic, latency, genital, through which the child must pass on the way to maturity. At the heart of it all, he placed the Oedipus complex, the theory that boys unconsciously desire their mothers and see their fathers as rivals, while girls experience a corresponding Electra complex and suffer from what he termed penis envy. These ideas scandalized polite society, and even now they provoke disbelief and anger. Were these daring revelations about the human condition, or projections of Freud's own obsessions and the culture of 19th century Vienna? The controversies did not end there. Freud's clinical cases, the stories on which he built his reputation, have themselves come under scrutiny. The famous patients Anna O. Dora, the Rat Man, the Wolf Man, became characters in the epic tale of psychoanalysis. Yet historians later uncovered evidence that Freud altered or omitted details, reshaping the narrative to make it fit his theoretical schemes. Dora, for instance, abandoned treatment after a few weeks, but Freud still presented her case as a confirmation of his method. The suspicion lingers that he was not only interpreting the unconscious, but also editing reality itself to serve his purposes. His views on women remain among the most bitterly contested. Freud described femininity in terms of lack, defined by the absence of a penis. He suggested that women were more narcissistic, more prone to hysteria, less capable of achieving the independence of men. Feminist critics accused him of reinforcing the very patriarchal structures that oppressed women, cloaking cultural bias in the language of science. To them, the theory of penis envy was not only insulting, but destructive, cementing inequality under the guise of psychological truth. Did Freud liberate humanity by daring to speak of desire, or did he imprison half of humanity by reducing women to deficient men? Even his personal experiments have left stains on his legacy. In the early years of his career, Freud became enamored with cocaine. He praised it as a wonder drug that could cure depression, digestive problems, even morphine addiction. He wrote academic papers extolling its virtues and even prescribed it to friends. For a time, he believed it might secure him fame in the medical world. But the dangers of cocaine soon became undeniable. Addiction, psychosis, ruin. Freud quietly retreated from his enthusiasm, but his reckless promotion of the drug remains a cautionary tale of how easily ambition can cloud judgment. And then there were the power struggles. Freud was not only a theorist, but also a leader of a movement surrounded by disciples and rivals. Carl Jung, Alfred Adler, Wilhelm Stekel each began as an ally, each broke away or was cast out when their ideas diverged from Freud's central dogma. Jung wanted to explore archetypes and spirituality. Adler emphasized inferiority and striving for power. Stekel wandered into symbolisms Freud disapproved of. One by one, they fell from grace. Freud demanded loyalty, and dissenters were expelled. Was this the act of a visionary defending a fragile new science, or the behavior of a dogmatist building an empire? In truth, Freud thrived on controversy. He seemed to know that his ideas would scandalize, that his theories would provoke outrage as much as admiration. He was not a quiet physician in the corner of Vienna. He was a cultural lightning rod. His work became a battlefield where questions of science, philosophy, morality, and culture clashed. And yet, through all the disputes, through all the accusations of fraud, misogyny, pseudoscience, and reckless behavior, Freud's name endured. Perhaps it endured because his ideas touched something raw in the human condition, something beyond the reach of ordinary science. Perhaps it endured because he was not only a doctor, but also a mythmaker, weaving stories about the unconscious that captured the imagination of the 20th century. This is the paradox with which we begin. To understand Freud's life, one must first face his contradictions head-on. He was a scientist and a storyteller, a healer and a manipulator, a liberator and an oppressor. His story is not the tale of a single man, but of an entire age wrestling with the mysteries of the mind. From his Jewish upbringing in the Austro-Hungarian Empire to his exile in London under the shadow of the Nazis, Freud's journey cannot be told without these controversies at its core. They are the lens through which we must view him, the turbulence that shaped his career, the echoes that still reverberate today. And only after passing through this storm of doubt and suspicion can we begin to trace the path of his early life, his medical training, and the first steps that would lead him toward the invention of psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud was born on the 6th of May, 1856, in the small Moravian town of Freiburg, part of the sprawling Austro-Hungarian Empire. His arrival into the world was not marked by wealth or privilege, but by the quiet resilience of a Jewish family living on the margins of society. His father, Jakob Freud, was a wool merchant of modest means, stern in temperament, a man who carried the heavy weight of tradition and poverty on his shoulders. His mother, Amalia, was 20 years younger than Jakob, lively and protective, and Sigmund would always speak of her with deep affection. In those early years, Freud's sense of belonging was shaped as much by hardship as by warmth, for the family soon moved to Vienna in search of stability, carrying with them the hopes and anxieties of so many Jewish families caught between tradition and assimilation in a rapidly changing Europe. The young Sigmund was precocious, a child who stood out almost immediately. He showed an insatiable appetite for knowledge, devouring books with an intensity that worried and impressed his parents. In Vienna, he was enrolled in the Leopoldstädter Communal Real Gymnasium, where his teachers quickly recognized his brilliance. Unlike many of his classmates, Freud seemed to have an ability to recall passages of literature, memorize languages, and grasp abstract ideas with uncanny speed. Latin and Greek were not simply academic exercises to him, they were gateways into the minds of ancient civilizations, seeds of his later fascination with myths and symbols. Yet alongside this intellectual promise was the constant shadow of his Jewish identity in a city where anti-Semitism lurked beneath the surface of social life. Freud's brilliance earned admiration, but it also set him apart, making him both exceptional and isolated. In his adolescence, Freud dreamed not of becoming a doctor, but of pursuing law or philosophy. The world of ideas drew him far more than the world of commerce his father inhabited. Yet practical concerns and the influence of mentors led him toward medicine, a field that seemed to offer both intellectual challenge and the possibility of advancement. In 1873, at the age of 17, he enrolled at the University of Vienna. There, he encountered the grandeur of science, as it was understood in the late 19th century, a time when biology and physics promised to explain the mysteries of life. Vienna was a city at the crossroads of culture, brimming with music, art, and political ferment, and Freud absorbed it all. The young man carried notebooks filled with observations, sketches, and ambitions that reached beyond the ordinary path of a medical student. But Freud's path was anything but straightforward. The study of medicine demanded years of grueling work in laboratories and clinics. He began as a student of zoology under Karl Claus, dissecting eels and tracing their nervous systems, an experience that taught him both patience and frustration. He later shifted to physiology under Ernst Brücke, who became one of his greatest influences. Brücke was a champion of the mechanistic view of life, the belief that every living process could ultimately be explained by physical and chemical laws. For Freud, this was both inspiring and confining. It gave him the discipline of careful observation, but it also clashed with his growing intuition that the human mind contained mysteries that could not be reduced to physiology alone. During these years, Freud struggled financially. His family could offer little support, and he often lived frugally, surviving on bread and coffee while he pursued his studies. Yet poverty did not break his spirit. Instead, it sharpened his determination to achieve something extraordinary. He read widely, not only in medicine but in philosophy, literature, and history. He was drawn to the writings of Goethe and Shakespeare, who filled his imagination with grand themes of desire, guilt, and fate. These voices of art and drama spoke to him in ways that the microscope and scalpel could not. They whispered that human beings were more than mere mechanisms, that behind every gesture and word lay a hidden story. It was also during these years that Freud encountered the darker aspects of human society in Vienna. Anti-Semitism grew more pronounced as nationalist movements took hold. Though Freud was not a religious Jew, his identity marked him as an outsider. Professorships and positions of influence were often denied to Jews, and Freud knew he would have to fight harder than others to carve out his place. The sense of being marginalized, of standing on the edge of acceptance, left a mark on his psyche. It taught him both defiance and suspicion, qualities that would later shape his fierce independence and his mistrust of authority outside his own circle. By the late 1872, Freud's ambitions began to crystallize. He wanted to explore the nervous system, to understand the seat of thought and sensation. He experimented with nerve cells, staining them with new techniques to trace their pathways. He published his first scientific papers, modest contributions, but enough to gain the attention of his teachers. Yet even then there was restlessness in him. He was not content to spend a lifetime cataloging neurons or dissecting animal tissues. He longed for a field where science touched the soul, where the secrets of human suffering could be revealed and perhaps healed. Personal life also began to stir within him. In 1882, Freud became engaged to Martha Bernays, the daughter of a respected Jewish family. Their engagement would last 4 long years, a period of letters filled with longing, frustration, and ambition. Freud's love for Martha was genuine, but it also became entangled with his drive for success. He wrote to her constantly about his struggles, his theories, his hopes of securing a career worthy of their future together. She was both confidant and muse, a presence that steadied him, even as his restless intellect pushed him toward uncharted territory. The formative years of Freud's life were thus a crucible of contrasts, the warmth of family and the sting of poverty, the promise of science and the pull of literature, the embrace of love and the weight of prejudice. Out of this mixture emerged a man who was both rigorously disciplined and wildly imaginative, both grounded in the methods of science and seduced by the mysteries of myth. Freud was not yet the father of psychoanalysis, not yet the controversial figure who would divide the 20th century. But the seeds were planted. The child of a modest Jewish household had grown into a young physician in Vienna, armed with knowledge, burdened with ambition, and already marked by the sense that he was destined to unsettle the world's understanding of the human mind. When Freud completed his medical studies, he did not step directly into fame, but into the dim and exhausting corridors of hospitals and laboratories where careers were made or broken in silence. He began working at the Vienna General Hospital in the early 1882, moving through departments of surgery, internal medicine, and psychiatry. The hospital was a place of suffering and ambition, where the poor came with their bodies broken and the young doctors came with their dreams sharpened by hunger. For Freud, it was both a training ground and a prison. He was skilled, diligent, respected by his superiors, but he knew he was only one among many. Advancement in Vienna's medical world demanded connections and wealth, and Freud had neither. His Jewish identity also meant that opportunities were narrower, doors quietly closed before he could even knock. To distinguish himself, he turned to research. He worked long hours in neurology, studying the structure of the brain, publishing careful observations on the medulla, the spinal cord, and nerve cells. He hoped to build a reputation as a scientist, one who could rise above prejudice through the sheer weight of discovery. He even translated works of the great French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot, whose bold studies of hysteria and hypnosis in Paris fascinated him. Freud saw in Charcot a model of courage, a man willing to say that mental illness was not possession or weakness, but a medical condition that could be studied and explained. Yet Freud's breakthrough did not come through the slow accumulation of neurological research. It came through a gamble, a sudden passion for a substance that seemed to promise both scientific advancement and personal glory: cocaine. In 1884, Freud obtained samples of the drug, newly isolated and little understood. To him, it appeared to be a miracle compound. He took it himself, feeling the rush of energy and confidence. He prescribed it to colleagues and friends, claiming it could ease depression, indigestion, and fatigue. He believed it could even cure morphine addiction, a scourge of the time. His papers praised cocaine with enthusiasm, declaring it a wonder of modern medicine. For a moment, it seemed Freud might achieve fame not through theories of the unconscious, but through chemistry. He dreamed of securing a place among the great innovators, the man who had brought relief to suffering patients with a new, safe stimulant. But the dream soured quickly. Reports emerged of cocaine's darker side: dependency, paranoia, collapse. One of Freud's closest friends, Ernst von Fleischl-Marxau, a brilliant physiologist who had struggled with morphine, tried Freud's cocaine treatment and became disastrously addicted. His decline was painful to witness, and Freud was forced to confront the unintended consequences of his recommendation. Though he quietly withdrew his praise of the drug, the stain remained. His critics would never forget his reckless enthusiasm, and even Freud himself later admitted that the episode had been a grave error. Still, the cocaine affair reveals something essential about Freud's character. He was daring, hungry for recognition, willing to risk much on an idea that promised greatness. He wanted not only to heal, but also to change the very direction of medicine. This ambition, dangerous and intoxicating, would carry him beyond neurology into uncharted territory. For while Freud worked in the wards of the hospital, he began to encounter cases that could not be explained by lesions or by anatomy. Patients came with paralysis in their limbs, though no physical damage could be found, with blindness, though their eyes were healthy, with uncontrollable convulsions that defied all tests. These were the mysteries labeled as hysteria, a diagnosis that was both a confession of ignorance and a dismissal of the patient's suffering. Freud was drawn to these enigmas. He read more of Charcot's work, where hypnosis seemed to lift the veil on hysteria, allowing patients to speak, to remember, to reveal hidden traumas. The idea that symptoms could emerge not from the body but from the mind began to fascinate him. He experimented with hypnosis himself, clumsy at first, then gradually more confident. He realized that the act of listening, of allowing the patient to speak freely, carried a power greater than the scalpel or microscope. Something hidden within memory, within desire, seemed to be pressing upon the body, shaping symptoms that baffled physicians. This realization marked a turning point. Freud began to drift from the hard edges of neurology into the ambiguous realm of the psyche. His colleagues in Vienna, committed to material science, often looked at him with skepticism, but Freud felt the pull of something larger. He could not ignore the whispers of the unconscious he thought he heard in his patients' stories. Medicine, as he had learned it, offered no answers here. If he was to make a name for himself, if he was to fulfill the restless ambition that drove him since boyhood, he would have to step beyond the safety of established science into a domain where evidence was slippery and controversy inevitable. Meanwhile, his personal life pressed upon him. His engagement to Martha Bernays, begun in 1882, stretched on while he struggled to establish himself. His letters to her reveal both tenderness and obsession. He poured his thoughts onto paper, his frustrations at slow progress, his irritation at colleagues, his dreams of a future where his name would stand among the immortals. Martha became not only his beloved, but the mirror against which he measured his worth. To marry her, he needed stability, income, a recognized place in Vienna's medical world. Each setback in his career was felt as a personal failure, each small success as a step toward the life he longed for. At last, in 1886, after years of struggle, Freud established a private practice in neurology, specializing in nervous disorders. He and Martha married, beginning a family that would grow to 6 children. His practice was modest at first, but it gave him independence, a place where he could test ideas without the oversight of skeptical superiors. Here, in the quiet rooms of his consulting office, Freud began to listen more closely to his patients, to their words, their slips, their silences. The cocaine dreams had faded, but another dream was forming, one that would change not only his life, but the intellectual history of the 20th century. Thus, the young doctor who had once dissected eels and praised cocaine was now on the threshold of a different kind of discovery. The nervous system he had studied under the microscope seemed less important than the hidden currents of memory and desire that surged in every patient who sat across from him. Freud was beginning to sense that behind the illnesses of the body lay stories unspoken, traumas unacknowledged, longings denied. If he could find a way to bring these to light, perhaps he could heal. If he could map the unseen terrain of the mind, perhaps he could achieve the greatness he had sought since his earliest days. The stage was set for the birth of psychoanalysis, though Freud himself did not yet know the storm it would unleash. When Freud opened his private practice, he was still a man in search of an identity, a physician trained in neurology, yet irresistibly drawn to the mysteries of the human mind. The turning point came through his association with Joseph Breuer, a respected Viennese physician more established than Freud, who had already been experimenting with unusual cases of hysteria. Breuer introduced Freud to a patient who would become legendary in the history of psychoanalysis, Bertha Pappenheim, known in the literature simply as Anna O. She was a young woman suffering from paralysis, hallucinations, speech disturbances, and strange compulsions. Conventional medicine had no explanation for her afflictions. Yet Breuer discovered that when she was encouraged to speak freely under hypnosis, to tell stories, to recall painful memories, her symptoms sometimes diminished. Anna herself called it the talking cure. Freud was fascinated. Here was evidence that the symptoms of hysteria might not be rooted in damaged nerves or hidden tumors, but in the psyche, in repressed emotions and forgotten experiences. The body was speaking a language of its own, translating mental anguish into physical symptoms. Freud saw in this the possibility of a revolution, a method of healing not by surgery or medication, but by words, by unlocking the buried contents of the unconscious. He collaborated with Breuer to publish their findings in Studies on Hysteria, 1895, a book that laid the foundation for psychoanalysis. Though Breuer remained cautious, unwilling to push the implications too far, Freud seized upon the ideas with unrelenting zeal. For him, this was not just a medical technique, it was a new science of the mind. But Freud was not satisfied with hypnosis alone. He found the technique unreliable, its effects temporary, and he began to search for another method. Out of this search emerged the practice of free association, encouraging patients to say whatever came into their minds without censorship. Freud listened not only to what was said, but to what was avoided, to the slips of the tongue, the sudden silences, the shifts in tone. He believed that these fragments revealed the pathways of repression, the hidden desires and traumas that shaped a person's inner life. Resistance itself became a clue, the unconscious struggling to protect its secrets. As Freud refined these methods, his theories deepened. He became convinced that repression was the central mechanism of the psyche, that unbearable desires, often of a sexual nature, were pushed out of consciousness, but continued to exert power from below. The unconscious, as he now conceived it, was not merely a shadow, but the engine of thought and behavior. Dreams, he argued, were the royal road to this hidden realm. In dreams, forbidden wishes found disguised expression, clothed in symbols and distortions, but still traceable to their origin. It was this conviction that drove him to write the work he considered his masterpiece, The Interpretation of Dreams, published in 1900, but completed in the years before the century turned. The book was not an instant success. It sold poorly at first and was largely ignored by the medical establishment. Yet Freud poured into it his most daring insights, analyzing his own dreams, including the famous dream of Irma's injection, in which he revealed his anxieties about his medical practice, his relationships, and his own unconscious wishes. For Freud, dreams were not random nonsense, but coded messages from the unconscious, requiring careful decoding through free association and analysis of symbols. The writing of this book was itself an act of audacity. Freud knew that he was challenging not only his colleagues, but the entire intellectual tradition that treated consciousness as the essence of the self. He was saying that human beings were not masters of their own minds, that beneath the surface lay forces they could neither see nor control. It was a radical blow to the Enlightenment faith in reason, a challenge to the very notion of free will. And yet Freud embraced the controversy, perhaps even courted it. He seemed to understand that the power of his ideas lay not only in their scientific claims, but in their capacity to unsettle, to force people to confront what they wished to deny. The publication of The Interpretation of Dreams marked the beginning of Freud's transformation from an obscure Viennese doctor into the founder of a movement. In the quiet of his consulting room, he continued to refine his methods, analyzing patients and writing essays that expanded his theories of sexuality, repression, and the unconscious. He also turned the analytic gaze upon himself, recording his dreams, his slips of the tongue, his memories of childhood. He believed that no one was exempt from the unconscious, not even the analyst. His willingness to dissect his own psyche gave his work a strange intimacy, a sense that the boundary between science and autobiography was dissolving. The years that followed were filled with struggle as well as discovery. Freud's practice was modest, his reputation fragile, and his circle of supporters small. Yet his ideas were gaining momentum. Students and colleagues began to gather around him, drawn by the force of his intellect and the daring of his theories. At the same time, opposition hardened. The medical establishment dismissed him. Critics mocked his obsession with sex, and even Breuer distanced himself from Freud's increasingly radical claims. But Freud, once again, thrived on the controversy. He sharpened his arguments, expanded his vision, and insisted that psychoanalysis was not a passing curiosity, but the foundation of a new understanding of the human condition. By the dawn of the new century, Freud had set in motion the intellectual revolution that would define his legacy. He had turned from the microscope to the mind, from cocaine experiments to the talking cure, from neurology to psychoanalysis. He had published a book that few read at first, but that would later be hailed as one of the most important works of modern thought. And though his name was not yet secure, the direction of his life was now fixed. He would not retreat into conventional medicine or abandon his daring theories. He would press forward through ridicule and resistance, determined to reveal the hidden truths of desire and repression, convinced that in the unconscious lay the key to understanding what it means to be human. As the first years of the new century unfolded, Freud found himself no longer an isolated figure scribbling into the void, but the reluctant leader of a movement. His consulting room in Vienna became the epicenter of a new intellectual current, a place where students, physicians, and curious thinkers gathered to hear the master speak about dreams, slips of the tongue, neuroses, and the hidden structures of the psyche. Slowly, a circle formed around him, disciples who believed they were taking part in something more than medicine, something closer to a revolution in human self-understanding. They met in what came to be known as the Wednesday Psychological Society, a modest gathering that would evolve into the International Psychoanalytical Association. In those cramped rooms, Freud read papers, presented case studies, and encouraged debate, though always with the quiet authority of one who expected loyalty above all. The young men who came to him, often arrived with reverence, convinced they had found a genius who could unlock the riddles of the mind. Among them were Wilhelm Stekel, a prolific interpreter of dreams and symbols; Otto Rank, a devoted secretary who recorded the proceedings; Alfred Adler, a sharp and independent thinker who emphasized feelings of inferiority and the struggle for power; and, most importantly, Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist whose charisma and Christian background made him a perfect candidate to carry psychoanalysis beyond the Jewish intellectual circles of Vienna. Freud saw in Jung not only a brilliant mind, but a bridge to broader respectability. To the outside world, Freud's Jewish identity was a liability, an excuse for critics to dismiss psychoanalysis as a tribal obsession. Jung, by contrast, was Protestant, blonde, and respected in Zurich. Freud, ever the strategist, embraced him as his heir apparent. But the inner circle was never free of tension. Freud's presence was commanding, but it was also domineering. He listened, but he expected agreement. Divergence was tolerated only so long as it did not threaten the core of his system. In the smoke-filled air of the Wednesday meetings, debate could be fierce, but the boundaries were clear. Psychoanalysis was about repression, the unconscious, and above all, sexuality. When Adler began to emphasize power rather than sex as the driving force of human behavior, Freud grew wary. Adler's idea of the inferiority complex struck many as a powerful insight, but to Freud it was a dangerous dilution of his theory. He confronted Adler, who in turn accused Freud of clinging to dogma. The rupture came in 1911, when Adler and a group of followers broke away to form their own school of individual psychology. Freud, wounded but unyielding, branded Adler a heretic and moved on. The greater drama came with Jung. At first, the bond between Freud and Jung seemed unbreakable. They exchanged letters filled with admiration, confessions, even dreams. Freud called Jung his crown prince, the future of psychoanalysis, but Jung's interests began to drift. He was fascinated by mythology, religion, and what he called the collective unconscious, a realm of archetypes and universal symbols that transcended the individual. To Freud, who insisted that the unconscious was rooted in repressed personal desires, especially sexual ones, Jung's mysticism was intolerable. The break was slow, painful, and dramatic. By 1913, their friendship had collapsed in bitterness. Jung accused Freud of dogmatism. Freud accused Jung of abandoning science for spiritual fantasy. What had once seemed like a partnership, destined to carry psychoanalysis into the future, became another chapter in the long story of Freud's broken alliances. These ruptures revealed as much about Freud's character as they did about the theories themselves. He demanded loyalty, not only to the man, but to the doctrine. He was capable of great warmth toward his followers, but his warmth often concealed a sharp edge. Those who stayed, such as Ernest Jones, Carl Abraham, and Sandor Ferenczi, remained loyal partly out of devotion, partly out of fear of expulsion. The movement itself began to resemble not just a scientific society, but a sect, with Freud as its patriarch, his writings treated as sacred texts, his authority unquestioned. Critics outside the circle called psychoanalysis a cult, and the charge was not entirely unfair. Yet for those within, there was a sense of participating in history, of being part of a discovery that redefined what it meant to be human. Meanwhile, Freud's theories grew more elaborate. He expanded his analysis of sexuality to include childhood development, published his 3 essays on the theory of sexuality in 1905, and continued to refine his understanding of dreams, neuroses, and the mechanisms of repression. The more he wrote, the more controversial he became, and the more he relished the role of provocateur. He knew the world would resist his ideas, but he also knew that resistance was part of their power. To be ignored was worse than to be hated, and Freud was never ignored. The conflicts with Adler and Jung did not destroy psychoanalysis. In some ways, they strengthened it by forcing Freud to clarify his own position. But they also revealed the fault lines that would haunt the movement forever. Psychoanalysis was not a unified science, but a battlefield of interpretations, each disciple carrying away a fragment of the master's vision to build their own school. Freud, ever proud, believed himself the guardian of the true doctrine, but he could not prevent his ideas from mutating, splintering, and spreading in directions he despised. By the eve of the First World War, Freud stood as both the founder of a growing international movement and the embattled leader of a fracturing community. His circle had expanded to America, where lectures at Clark University in 1909 had introduced his ideas to a new audience. He returned from that trip with recognition, but also with a sense of the scale of the challenge ahead. Psychoanalysis was no longer confined to Vienna. It had become a global phenomenon. Yet its foundations were fragile, and its leader was increasingly isolated. Freud himself seemed to thrive in this paradox, nourished by controversy, unwilling to bend, convinced that history would vindicate him even if his colleagues betrayed him. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 shook Europe to its core, and Freud, like so many intellectuals of his time, found himself staring into the abyss of human destruction. His sons were called to military service, his patience dwindled as the world turned to survival, and the optimism of the early 20th century collapsed in fire and blood. The war was more than a political or military crisis. It was a psychological one, exposing the fragility of civilization and the ferocity of instincts buried beneath the surface. For Freud, the trenches and the slaughter were confirmation of something he had long suspected, that beneath the thin veneer of reason and morality, humanity was ruled by darker, primitive forces. As the guns thundered across Europe, Freud continued to write, reflecting on what the war revealed about the human psyche. He had once believed that pleasure and sexuality, the libido, were the central drives of the unconscious. But the war forced him to confront something else, a force not of pleasure but of destruction. Soldiers returned from the front not only with shattered bodies, but with shattered minds, plagued by nightmares, compulsive reenactments of trauma, symptoms that resisted ordinary explanation. Freud called it repetition compulsion, the strange tendency of the mind to relive pain rather than avoid it. From this observation emerged one of his most controversial ideas: the death drive, a force within the psyche that pushes toward aggression, self-destruction, and ultimately a return to inorganic stillness. The death drive shocked even his loyal followers. It seemed to contradict his earlier emphasis on libido, on the pleasure principle as the foundation of mental life. But Freud insisted that life was a struggle between two primal forces: Eros, the drive toward life, love, and creation, and Thanatos, the drive toward death, aggression, and dissolution. Civilization itself, he argued, was built upon the uneasy balance of these forces, a fragile dam holding back the flood of violence and desire. The war had made the reality of Thanatos undeniable. Alongside this radical new vision, Freud reshaped his model of the mind. His earlier division between the conscious, preconscious, and unconscious now seemed too simple. The complexities of repression, resistance, and conflict demanded a new architecture. In the 1,920 seconds, he introduced the structural model id, ego, and superego. The id, blind and chaotic, was the reservoir of instincts, the raw drives of sex and aggression that demanded satisfaction without regard for reality or morality. The ego, arising from the id, but shaped by contact with the external world, was the mediator, negotiating between instinct and reality, between desire and what was possible. The superego, formed from parental authority and cultural norms, was the voice of conscience, the internalized law that punished the ego with guilt when it failed to restrain the id. This new model gave Freud's theory both clarity and drama. The psyche was not a harmonious unity, but a battlefield, a stage upon which conflicting forces struggled endlessly. To live was to endure the tension between instinct and morality, between desire and law. The unconscious was no longer just a hidden basement of repressed wishes. It was a dynamic arena where id, ego, and superego clashed, each shaping behavior in ways that left the conscious mind only dimly aware of its true motives. Freud's writings of this period, including Beyond the Pleasure Principle, 1920, and The Ego and the Id, 1923, deepened his reputation as both a revolutionary and a provocateur. Critics accused him of inventing abstractions that could never be proven, of turning psychology into mythology. Supporters hailed him as a thinker who dared to look into the abyss, who explained the madness of the modern world in terms no one else had dared to articulate. For Freud himself, these years were marked by both triumph and suffering. He had become internationally recognized, his books translated, his lectures attended with fascination and hostility alike. Yet his health began to falter. A persistent cancer of the jaw, forcing multiple surgeries, leaving him in constant pain and with a prosthetic device that made speaking difficult. Even in pain, Freud continued to work, refusing to be silent. His personal suffering seemed to mirror the suffering of a Europe reeling from war and upheaval, yet he transformed that pain into theory, into words that carried his ideas further than ever before. The world outside his study was unstable, fractured by violence and politics, and the world inside his study was equally turbulent, fractured by instincts and repression. The parallel was not lost on him. Civilization itself, he believed, was a fragile compromise, much like the human psyche, a compromise always threatened by the forces it sought to contain. By the middle of the 1920 seconds, Freud stood as both a titan and a pariah. He had built a theory of the mind that explained war, guilt, love, dreams, neurosis, and even civilization itself. But he had also invited endless controversy, challenging religion, morality, and the cherished belief that humans were rational masters of their fate. His theories were attacked as pseudoscience, as dangerous, as immoral. Yet they spread, entering not only psychology but art, literature, politics, and everyday speech. To speak of repression, of slips, of the unconscious, of ego and superego, these had become part of modern culture, phrases that ordinary people used without realizing they were invoking Freud. The war had transformed the world and transformed Freud. He was no longer the young doctor experimenting with hypnosis or the scandalous thinker obsessed with infantile sexuality. He was now the architect of a vast theory of the mind, a man who claimed to have revealed the tragic truth of human existence, that we are ruled by forces we cannot see, torn between the drive to live and the drive to die, forever caught in the conflicts of id, ego, and superego. It was a bleak vision, but Freud never flinched from bleakness. He believed it was better to face the truth, however dark, than to live in comforting illusions. And as the interwar years advanced, bringing new political storms, he would find himself applying this vision not only to individuals, but to entire civilizations, analyzing society itself as though it were a patient on his couch. By the late 1920 seconds, Freud was no longer speaking only as a doctor or theorist of the unconscious. He had become a philosopher of civilization, compelled to extend his ideas beyond the consulting room and into the troubled state of the modern world. The war had shown him the raw power of human aggression, and the fragile peace that followed seemed to him less a triumph of reason than a temporary truce between instincts that would inevitably break down again. The same patterns he observed in his patients, conflict between desire and prohibition, between id and superego, he now saw in entire societies. Civilization itself was, in Freud's vision, a psychological phenomenon, a grand compromise between instinct and order. In 1927, he published The Future of an Illusion, a short but incendiary book that addressed religion directly. Freud did not approach faith as a theologian or a believer, but as a psychoanalyst. He argued that religion was a collective neurosis, an illusion created by humanity's need for protection and order. Just as a child looks to a father for security, so societies projected a divine father in the heavens, a figure who promised justice, safety, and meaning in a world otherwise filled with danger. Religion, he insisted, was not a revelation of truth, but a psychological defense mechanism born of fear and longing. It had served a purpose in restraining human instincts, but in the modern world it was an obstacle holding humanity in perpetual immaturity. To progress, Freud declared, humanity must abandon these illusions and face reality without gods. The reaction was explosive. Religious thinkers condemned him as arrogant, blind, destructive. Even some of his allies hesitated, uneasy at the starkness of his attack. But Freud, true to form, welcomed the controversy. He was not trying to win friends. He was trying to tell what he believed to be the truth, however unsettling. He wrote not as a preacher, but as a diagnostician, and his diagnosis was bleak. Humanity clung to illusions because it could not bear the harshness of life. To grow up meant to renounce them, however painful the loss. 2 years later, he deepened this analysis with Civilization and Its Discontents, 1930, perhaps his most profound and disturbing cultural work. In it, Freud argued that civilization was built not only on the suppression of instinct, but on a repression so deep that it produced perpetual unhappiness. Human beings, driven by the twin forces of Eros and Thanatos, desired love, freedom, and pleasure. But civilization demanded restraint, discipline, sacrifice. To live together peacefully, individuals had to curb their instincts, renounce aggression, accept the authority of law. This repression created culture, art, morality, community, but it also created discontent, a gnawing sense of frustration that no progress could ever eliminate. In pages that still resonate with unsettling power, Freud describes civilization as a fragile dam holding back an ocean of aggression. He spoke of guilt as the price of culture, the internalized superego punishing individuals for desires they could never fully escape. The very things that made civilization possible, laws, prohibitions, moral codes, were the sources of suffering, condemning humans to live in a permanent state of conflict with themselves. Happiness, he suggested, was not the natural destiny of man, but a fleeting accident achieved only at moments when instinct and order briefly aligned. These works revealed Freud at his most pessimistic. He no longer believed that psychoanalysis could deliver humanity from its ills. At best, it could make individuals more aware of the conflicts within them, less enslaved by unconscious forces, but it could not resolve the fundamental tension between instinct and civilization. To be human was to be torn, to live in conflict, to seek pleasure and freedom in a world that demanded repression and restraint. The best we could hope for, Freud suggested, was to exchange neurotic misery for ordinary unhappiness. For his critics, such pronouncements confirmed their suspicion that Freud was a prophet of despair, a man who stripped away illusions and left nothing but emptiness in their place. For his admirers, they revealed a rare courage, a willingness to look at human existence without the comforting veils of religion or utopia. Whether loved or hated, Freud was now a thinker who transcended his discipline, a cultural figure whose words touched philosophy, politics, literature, and art. His bleak vision of civilization's discontents seemed all the more relevant as Europe drifted once again toward crisis, with nationalism rising, economies collapsing, and the shadows of fascism lengthening across the continent. Through it all, Freud continued to write, even as his body weakened. Cancer gnawed at him relentlessly. each surgery leaving him in more pain, each prosthetic device in his mouth making speech more difficult. Yet he refused to stop, working with the determination of a man who knew his time was limited but who still believed his words could outlast him. His study in Vienna remained filled with antiquities, statues of gods and heroes from vanished civilizations. They surrounded him like silent witnesses, a reminder that all cultures perish, but also that ideas can endure. Freud seemed to see himself in those artifacts, a relic of the old world, yet one still speaking to the new. Thus, by the 1932, Freud had become not just the father of psychoanalysis, but a cultural philosopher of the darkest kind, insisting that humanity must abandon illusions and face the tragic structure of life. He spoke of instinct and repression, of eros and thanatos, of id, ego, and superego, not only as the machinery of individual psychology, but as the forces shaping entire civilizations. To his followers, he was a prophet of truth. To his enemies, he was a corrupter, a nihilist, a destroyer of meaning. And yet, whether embraced or rejected, his voice could not be ignored. The man who once treated a handful of hysterical patients in Vienna was now speaking to the fate of humanity itself. The final decade of Freud's life unfolded like a grim echo of his theories about conflict and repression, as if history itself had taken on the shape of a tragic psychoanalytic case. By the early 1932, he was an old man, worn down by illness but still working, still writing, still surrounded by the antiquities that filled his study in Vienna. Cancer of the jaw had tormented him since 1923. Requiring more than 30 operations and leaving him with a prosthetic device he called his monster. Speaking was painful, eating a trial, and the odor of decay was constant. Yet he continued to receive patients, to dictate to his daughter Anna, to craft essays that sharpened his dark vision of humanity. He worked because he could not stop. Work was his way of living, even as his body betrayed him. Around him, the world darkened. Austria was sliding into the grip of fascism, and by 1938, the Nazi shadow had fallen directly on Vienna. Freud, a Jew, a symbol of the intellectual cosmopolitanism the Nazis despised, was an obvious target. At first, he tried to remain calm, to deny the danger. He was 78 years old, sick, weary. He did not wish to leave the city that had been his home for more than 70 years. But reality pressed in. The Nazis marched into Austria in March 1938, the Anschluss, and Vienna erupted with anti-Jewish violence. Shops were looted, neighbors turned against neighbors, and the Freud household itself was raided. His daughter Anna was arrested and interrogated by the Gestapo, released only after hours of fear. Friends urged him to flee, but leaving required negotiation, money, and humiliating concessions. Freud, who had spent a lifetime analyzing illusions, now faced the collapse of the illusion that he might be spared. With the help of influential friends, including the American ambassador and Princess Marie Bonaparte, arrangements were finally made for his escape. The Nazis demanded exorbitant taxes, signed statements, humiliations. Freud himself, with characteristic irony, signed a form declaring he had been treated with respect by the Gestapo, then added a bitter line, "I can most highly recommend the Gestapo to anyone." In June 1938, he and his family finally left Vienna, crossing into France and then on to London, where they settled at 20 Maresfield Gardens in Hampstead. He had left behind the city that had shaped him, a city he both loved and resented, now poisoned by hatred. Vienna without Freud was unimaginable, but Freud without Vienna was equally so. In London, he found peace of a kind, though his body was failing. He was received with respect, visited by admirers, but he knew he was nearing the end. His study was recreated as it had been in Vienna, the antiquities carefully arranged, the couch placed in the same position. Surrounded by those ancient figures, he worked on his last book, Moses and Monotheism, a provocative reinterpretation of the biblical prophet as an Egyptian who brought monotheism to the Jews. The book scandalized many, not least because it questioned Jewish identity at a time of rising persecution. But Freud, true to himself, refused to soften his arguments. He would go to his grave provoking, unsettling, tearing away illusions. The cancer grew worse. Eating became almost impossible, pain relentless. His faithful dog, a chow named Jofi, no longer lay beside him, for he could not bear even her presence when the stench of his disease grew overwhelming. Yet Freud endured, working until the very end. Anna, his devoted daughter, stayed at his side, caring for him, protecting him. She had become not only his child, but his intellectual heir, the guardian of psychoanalysis as her father's body gave way. In September 1939, as another world war erupted, Freud asked his physician and friend Max Schur to keep the promise he had made long before, not to let him suffer needlessly. On September 21, Schur administered morphine, easing him into unconsciousness. 2 days later, Sigmund Freud died in London, far from the city of his youth, far from the empire that had once nurtured his ambition, but surrounded by family, by books, by the fragments of ancient civilizations that had always reminded him of the transience of human glory. He was cremated, his ashes placed in an ancient Greek urn given to him by Princess Bonaparte, a fitting resting place for a man who had spent his life interpreting myths and symbols. In death, as in life, Freud remained a figure both monumental and controversial. To some, he was the destroyer of illusions, the prophet who revealed the unconscious, the man who forced humanity to look inward with new eyes. To others, he was a fraud, a dogmatist, a pseudoscientist whose theories were little more than elaborate storytelling. But whatever judgment one makes, his influence is undeniable. He changed not only psychology, but the way modern people think about themselves, their desires, their dreams, their culture. He left behind not a set of certainties, but a landscape of questions, a restless field of inquiry that continues to provoke, inspire, and divide. Thus ended the life of Sigmund Freud, a man whose journey carried him from the narrow streets of Freiburg to the intellectual salons of Vienna, from the laboratories of medicine to the depths of the unconscious, from the optimism of a new century to the despair of exile. He died as he had lived, controversial, unyielding, and endlessly fascinating. And even now, long after the wars that shook his world have passed, his voice lingers, asking whether we truly know ourselves or whether, as he always insisted, we remain strangers to the hidden forces that rule our lives. When Freud died in 1939, it might have seemed that his theories would fade with him, dismissed as relics of a bygone era. Yet in the decades that followed, psychoanalysis did not disappear. It spread across continents, languages, and disciplines, becoming one of the most influential and divisive intellectual movements of the 20th century. His disciples, fractured though they were, carried the torch. Some remained faithful to his doctrines, repeating them like sacred texts. Others broke away, reshaping his ideas to suit their own visions. But whether loyal or rebellious, they all worked in Freud's shadow. In the United States, psychoanalysis found fertile ground, particularly after the Second World War. Refugees from Europe, many of them Jewish analysts trained in Vienna or Berlin, brought Freud's teachings with them. In cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, institutes were founded, patients flocked to couches, and psychoanalysis became a cultural phenomenon. In Hollywood, filmmakers consulted analysts, and the language of repression and desire seeped into scripts. In literature, poets and novelists found inspiration in the idea of the unconscious, in dreams, in the conflicts between id, ego, and superego. Even in advertising and politics, Freud's nephew Edward Bernays applied psychoanalytic ideas to mass persuasion. helping to create the modern industry of public relations. But with this expansion came criticism. By mid-century, new forms of psychology were emerging. Behaviorism in America, which focused on observable actions rather than hidden desires. Later, cognitive psychology, which sought to map the mind through experiments and models. These disciplines dismissed Freud's theories as unscientific, untestable, too reliant on speculation. Philosophers like Karl Popper declared psychoanalysis a pseudoscience, a system that explained everything and therefore explained nothing. Feminist thinkers attacked Freud's ideas about women, exposing the sexism embedded in concepts like penis envy and female inferiority. Historians revisited his case studies and accused him of manipulation, exaggeration, even fabrication. Yet Freud could not be erased. His ideas were too deeply embedded in culture, too provocative to be ignored. Even his critics could not avoid him. To reject Freud was still to engage with him, to define oneself against him. And outside of psychology proper, his influence thrived. In art, surrealists like Salvador Dalí and André Breton embraced the unconscious as a source of creativity, inspired directly by Freud's writings on dreams. In literature, writers from James Joyce to Virginia Woolf to Thomas Mann wove psychoanalytic themes into their works. In philosophy, figures such as Jacques Lacan reinterpreted Freud through the lens of linguistics and structuralism, giving psychoanalysis a second life in the intellectual ferment of post-war France. Freud had not simply founded a school of therapy, he had changed the vocabulary of modern existence. Words like repression, denial, the unconscious, even the Freudian slip entered everyday language. To dream of something strange was no longer meaningless, it was a puzzle, a message from the depths. To forget a name, to make a mistake in speech, to develop a nervous tic, these were now seen as clues to hidden truths. Ordinary people who had never read a line of Freud still lived in a world shaped by his concepts. But the legacy was never simple. Psychoanalysis itself fractured into rival camps. Some clung to orthodox Freudianism, others followed Jung into the realm of archetypes, others embraced Adler's psychology of inferiority, still others, like Melanie Klein, Anna Freud, and later object relations theorists, focused on early childhood bonds and the role of the mother. The proliferation of schools made psychoanalysis less a unified science than a constellation of competing visions, all tracing their lineage back to the master in Vienna. Critics saw this as proof that Freud had built not a science but a mythology, endlessly adaptable, impossible to test. Admirers saw it as proof of the richness of his insights, his ability to open questions that generations could not stop debating. As the century wore on, Freud's reputation rose and fell like the tide. In the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds, psychoanalysis dominated psychiatry in the West, shaping treatment, training, and cultural conversation. By the 1,980 seconds, neuroscience and pharmaceuticals had begun to eclipse it, offering chemical cures for depression and anxiety that seemed faster and more reliable than years on a couch. Universities taught Freud less as a scientist and more as a cultural theorist, a figure to be studied alongside Marx and Nietzsche, the trio Paul Ricoeur once called the masters of suspicion. And yet, in moments of crisis, Freud returned. His ideas about aggression, repression, the fragility of civilization seemed newly relevant in the wake of wars, genocides, and political upheaval. His writings on religion, illusion, and guilt continued to provoke debate in philosophy and theology. His case studies, flawed though they might have been, still fascinated students of literature and history. His life itself, with its blend of ambition, suffering, and controversy, remained a subject of biographies, films, and endless fascination. To speak of Freud's legacy is to speak of a paradox. He was wrong in many ways, his theories of infantile sexuality exaggerated, his interpretations biased, his evidence weak by scientific standards, and yet he was also right in a deeper sense, right that we are not masters of ourselves, right that hidden forces shape our thoughts and actions, right that dreams and slips and symptoms carry meanings we do not fully understand. He revealed that beneath the surface of reason lies another world, a world we cannot escape. Even his fiercest critics, by acknowledging the unconscious, by probing human desire in their own ways, remain in dialogue with him. Thus, Freud lives on, not as a set of doctrines to be accepted, but as a restless voice, a provocation, a challenge. His legacy is not stability, but debate, not certainty, but questioning. He left behind a discipline in perpetual turmoil, a culture forever transformed, and a vision of humanity that is as troubling as it is illuminating. He showed us that we are strangers to ourselves, that civilization is built on repression, that desire and death dance together in the dark. Whether one calls him a genius or a fraud, one cannot deny that he changed the way we think, and that in every conversation about the human mind, Freud is there, silent but insistent, demanding to be reckoned with. To look back upon the life of Sigmund Freud is to look upon a man who stood at the crossroads of science, culture, and myth, and who never hesitated to step into the storm. From the narrow beginnings of his childhood in Freiburg to the grandeur and decay of Vienna, from the laboratory benches where he dissected nerve cells to the consulting room where he listened to broken voices, from the reckless enthusiasm for cocaine to the slow, deliberate construction of psychoanalysis, his path was never smooth, never free of doubt or controversy. And yet, through all the triumphs and failures, Freud carried within him a conviction that the human mind was larger, stranger, and more dangerous than most dared to imagine. He revealed a truth that civilization did not want to hear, that beneath our rational selves lies a wilderness of instincts, desires, fears, and compulsions. He showed that dreams are not nonsense, but coded expressions of longing, that slips of the tongue are not accidents, but clues, that neuroses are not weaknesses, but signals of battles being fought in the unconscious. He forced us to admit that repression shapes our lives, that sexuality is not confined to adulthood, but pervades our earliest years, that love and aggression are inseparable twins, driving the course of history as much as the course of individual lives. And yet Freud was also deeply flawed. He twisted case studies, clung stubbornly to theories, even when evidence failed, and often dismissed critics with arrogance. His views on women revealed the prejudices of his age. His ambition sometimes blinded him, and his movement too often resembled a sect demanding loyalty rather than an open forum for inquiry. He was not a saint of science, but a restless spirit, forever pushing forward, forever provoking, forever refusing to retreat into safe consensus. If he was wrong in his details, he was right in his daring. The daring to confront the hidden forces that govern us, the daring to suggest that reason is not our master, but our fragile servant. After his death, the world he left behind was scarred by wars, genocides, and revolutions, but also transformed by new sciences, new philosophies, new arts. In all of these, Freud's voice echoed. Surrealists painted dreams inspired by his writings. Novelists crafted characters torn by unconscious desires. Philosophers debated his pessimism. Therapists reimagined his methods. Even critics who despised him could not ignore him. His concepts entered common speech. His ideas reshaped law, politics, education, and even marketing. No other figure in modern thought has been so simultaneously rejected and embraced, condemned and celebrated, buried and resurrected. Perhaps this is Freud's true legacy, not the precise content of his theories, but the attitude he instilled, the refusal to accept the surface of things, the insistence that what is hidden matters as much as what is visible, that the human being is a mystery layered with contradictions. He taught us to look inward, even if what we find disturbs us. He taught us that civilization is not a triumph of harmony, but a fragile compromise, that happiness is fleeting, that truth is uncomfortable. He left us not with comfort, but with questions, not with certainty, but with unease. And maybe that is why he endures. In every age, people seek illusions to protect themselves from the harshness of reality. Freud tore illusions away, exposing the rawness beneath. He was accused of nihilism, of despair, of destroying meaning. But perhaps what he offered was something else, a deeper honesty, a recognition that to live fully we must confront not only our hopes but also our fears, not only our virtues but also our darkest instincts. Freud's life was a testament to the belief that facing the truth, however painful, is more valuable than clinging to comforting lies. In the end, Freud's story is the story of humanity itself, striving for knowledge, stumbling in error, yearning for greatness, undone by weakness, yet always compelled to search for meaning in the face of chaos. He was not simply a man of science, nor merely a philosopher, nor only a doctor. He was all of these and more, a figure who blurred the boundaries between disciplines, between truth and myth, between discovery and invention. He died in exile, his body broken, his homeland lost, but his ideas survived, scattering across the world like fragments of a dream. Today, whether we admire or despise him, whether we call him genius or fraud, whether we follow him or reject him, we remain in dialogue with Freud. His questions still haunt us. Do we truly know ourselves? Are we masters of our choices, or are we puppets of unconscious forces? Can civilization tame our instincts, or will our instincts always threaten to tear civilization apart? These questions have no final answer, but in asking them, Freud gave us a mirror, however cracked, in which to see ourselves more clearly. Thus, the life of Sigmund Freud closes not with certainty, but with ambiguity, not with triumph or defeat, but with an unresolved tension that mirrors the very nature of the human mind he sought to understand. His couch is empty, his voice is silent, yet the echoes remain. And as long as we dream, as long as we slip in our speech, as long as we struggle with guilt and desire, Freud will be there, whispering from the shadows, reminding us that the unconscious never dies.